Hi, everybody. This is Guy DiMartino. For those who know me, I'm a lawyer in Northwest Indiana and I'm a lawyer in Florida. And today I'm joined with Walter Reeves, who's a lawyer in Texas, and Nick Rishwain from California, who's a lawyer but doesn't practice as a lawyer. He's from experts.com. And what we're going to do today is spend a few minutes discussing an accident that happened in Kansas City and the fact that just recently, the owners of the company, or two owners of the company, have been indicted for criminal charges. And for those of you who remember, I want to go back to the 1970s. Walter, it looks like you might have been around then when I was around there. Nick, you look a little young, so maybe not. So in September 1974, there were three girls in Elkhart, Indiana, that were driving in a Ford Pinto. And these girls were two sisters and a cousin. And the Ford Pinto was hit from behind and exploded. And for those who remember the Ford Pinto cases, those cars came on fire so much that there was a problem. And so a month later, the Elkhart County prosecutor, now Elkhart is where they build all the RVs nowadays, it's in the South Bend area. Elkhart County prosecutor presents this to a grand jury. And the grand jury comes back against Ford Motor Corporation and indicts them on charges of criminal recklessness. And even though you couldn't hold somebody personally accountable, the issue was that Ford could be fined. And when all the discovery went through in that case, what they determined was that Ford knew that there was a problem with the bumper system where the fuel tank was. It was close to the trunk. But what they could do is they could have fixed it by putting a barrier in between, but they would have had to retool all their factories. And so they did a cost-benefit analysis of the folks that would be injured and the money that they would have to pay out, what it would cost to have to retool and call all these cars back and fix them. So they looked at profits over people. And so here, in this case, what the prosecutor has done in Kansas City, now let me step back. So 2 years ago, a 10-year-old boy was on this new water slide ride. And the water slide ride had prior problems with folks. And the issue was that the actual raft could get up somewhere around 70 miles per hour. And the raft would become airborne. And so what happened to this poor child is his raft, he was 10 years old, became airborne and it hit a piece of metal and he was decapitated. And there was a civil matter that was filed and they settled the case for somewhere in the millions of dollars. I think some of the news reports say $20 million. But what happened now is that the prosecutor has presented this to a grand jury, and the grand jury has come back with an indictment against some of the folks from this company. So first, I'd like to throw it over to Walter, who does a little bit of criminal law, and we can speak to that issue if you would, Walter. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I do a lot of criminal law, but yeah, it's unusual for what most people think of as a civil case to end up as a criminal prosecution, but it does happen, and we've seen from time to time where even auto accidents can turn into aggravated assault and murder cases. The burden is different, and there's different degrees of offenses. At least I can only speak to Texas, but in any criminal case, your offense and the seriousness of the charge is based on what's called your mental state. What was in your mind when you committed the offense, and in cases like this, there's really two. One is criminal negligence, which is a lower standard, and it's basically if you just disregard standards or do things that an ordinary person wouldn't do. And the other, which is apparently more attuned to this case, is actually a manslaughter charge, which is somebody being aware of the risks of their conduct and ignoring them.
So let's go back just one step. There's two ways in most places to charge somebody with a crime, right? One is take it to a grand jury, and then some states have either you file an information or an affidavit or something along those lines. Is that right, Walter? I don't do criminal law.
It depends on the charge. I don't know that I'm aware of any state that where a felony offense can be pursued without presenting it to a grand jury.
Okay. So in this case, the prosecutor brought it to the grand jury. What's that like? I mean, how does that work? You know, when folks hear things about jury, they think it might be like somebody who's ruling or making a determination on somebody's guilt or innocent. But what's this thing about a grand jury?
I mean, it doesn't mean what most people think it means. A grand jury is in most places made up of people sort of like a jury. But the function of a grand jury is significantly different in that their only purpose and their only function is to determine if there's enough evidence to allow the state to go forward. So it's a much lower burden of proof, and the really significant difference between a grand jury and a regular jury is that a grand jury only hears one side of the case. The state controls the process, so they present what they want the grand jury to hear. A defendant has no right to appear before the grand jury. If they do, they generally don't have the right to go in there with their counsel. So whether or not you get indicted, depends on what the state presents to the grand jury. There's kind of an old saying that's been around for years, and that's any prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich if they want to, and it depends. The grand jury is only going to hear what the prosecutor presents to them, so it's a pretty one-sided presentation, and grand jury is free to ask questions and to kind of explore as they want, but the information is controlled by one side.
So what I hear you saying is that this is just a determination about whether a case can be brought or charges that are filed. Has nothing to do with these guys' guilt or innocence at this point in time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an indictment, and in fact, whenever you go to trial, you actually get an instruction that an indictment is no evidence of guilt. It's simply the way that a case is brought into court. It's much like, it's similar to a traffic ticket. An officer writes you a ticket, and that's how you get your case into court and get to present it to a judge or a jury.
Okay. Thanks. So Nick, yes. The news reports have said this. The news reports said that the evidence that was presented to the grand jury showed that the folks did not follow amusement park standards, that they lacked their own expertise in the design, that they ignored warnings and whistleblowers about the safety of the ride, that they failed to maintain the slide after it was built, and that they might have covered up some evidence. So let's talk about this from standards and experts and things along those lines. If you can shed some light on how all this will play out.
Sure. So yeah, I read much of the similar information that you said there, and the ASTM International, they write these standards for all sorts of different industries. And one group, the F24 group, happens to write standards for amusement parks and amusement rides and devices. So this is an amusement ride. And what we're hearing in the news is that they've failed to live up to standards, and I'm guessing they mean this ASTM F24 standard. That would be my guess. There are other standards that they may have, where they may have fallen below the duty of care in either the construction or the engineering of this piece of equipment. But my idea is, what I'm reading is there's some design failures. There's some failures to follow industry standards in the construction and safety of this piece of equipment. And it also sounds like that they've avoided necessary repairs, so there may be a failure to maintain, which could be negligent, or as we're seeing in this indictment, they're finding that it's some criminal negligence there. There's some evidence or allegations that I shouldn't say evidence, I should say allegations, that brake systems have previously failed. So that also goes to their failing to maintain this system. So there's a variety of experts who could be used in this type of situation. Now we're talking about it from the criminal aspect. I'm assuming that they had an engineer, somebody who's an amusement park expert in the civil case. They may need somebody like that in the criminal case as well, to show that the failures to live up to these standards, and if they were concealing the failures to live up to these standards, or their breach of these standards, I think that probably rises to the level of criminality, or at least what the prosecutor and grand jury have claimed here. So there are a wide variety of experts that I would use in here. I don't know if you want me to go through all of them, but that I would, ideally, if I had to answer every question that the allegations are providing, there's quite a few different experts I would use.
So in looking at this, and I'm a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Mm-hmm.
do negligence work, I
Mm-hmm.
just assumed that they were national standards for amusement parks, that they were regulatory bodies that looked over these amusement parks. And this is what I thought was really, and this is something that folks need to take home and understand, because they're going to be responsible for themselves and for their
Mm-hmm.
kids. That there was a push in the 70s and 80s to have federal regulations, that this would be under the Federal Consumer Protection Agency,
Mm-hmm.
the CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission. Okay.
Okay.
And then they did away with that, and it went to each individual state. And what I've seen in my research is there's some states that have no regulations, that
Mm-hmm.
any amusement park or carnival, they can do whatever they want. There's other states that have very small oversight, where you can go and hire a private company to do your inspections, but then you don't have to report any problems with the stuff to the state. And then there are and then there are other states where you have people who do inspections, but it's like county inspectors. And so these are the same inspectors that might be looking at houses, and when you look at amusement parks, you would think that there would be some type of, hierarchy or some type of engineers, because some of these rides are so elaborate. So I found that really, really, and bringing it back to this case, there were emails, and there was information from folks who were working on it that said nobody under 16 should really use this ride.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that all the time when we go out to rides, that we have height restrictions for kids or weight restrictions for kids. And so I'm assuming if this boy was probably 16 years old, he would have weighed, maybe 25% more or 50% more, and maybe the raft would not have gone up as high and caused the issue. So my first take home for parents is this. If there are weight and height and age restrictions on rides, even though you think your child is more mature, is heavier, is taller than the average, you need to follow those restrictions, because they're there for a reason. So that would be one of my take homes for folks who are listening. Walter, do you have any take homes for folks who might be listening regarding this? They're going out to a carnival, they're going out to Six Flags, they're going out to some amusement park.
I think That's the big one that I have is I think most people, and I just remember back when my kids were young, and you always have that fight every time you get in line, and you got one that's not old enough. Most people I don't think really understand that those are there for the protection of the kids, and that they have that there are reasons for that, and that bad things can happen. So I mean, I think that's the big takeaway that I have, along with, I guess the takeaway, not so much for parents, is that, some things that you don't think are criminal acts or criminal conduct can end up and land you in criminal court just because you don't do the things that most people would do.
And that's something that's strange. In my years, I've seen that. And what happens is that sometimes, in most parts of the world, I can't talk about Kansas City and I can't talk about Texas, but prosecutors or state's attorneys, they're elected. And when you have something that is really hits folks in the face, where there's a tragedy, a lot of times folks put pressure on the prosecutor's office. And I don't know that that's the case here in Kansas City, but, they're humans and, they have their desire to keep their office and to look, tough on crime. And so sometimes criminal cases are brought just because of the pressure in the community, even though in this matter, there was a civil action, and there was probably some type of administrative action taken. Maybe they lost their licenses or something like that, or the park had to close down or something like that. But now here you're dealing with the criminal matter, and sometimes, this is 2 years after the fact. I mean, you just wonder what would drive, to a criminal action against folks in a corporation per se. I can understand a drunk driving case.
Guy, if I might, I happened to read that the child whose life was lost, his father is a state representative in Kansas City. So, this is not that any kid should have to experience this, but Dad may have had some push to move this along into something awful or something more serious than that civil case. Because as I read, the father is a state representative. Also, it sounds like this park is not reopened since that accident.
Right.
So there's no income from this park. It seems to be. I'm assuming that what I read was accurate, but so there does seem to be some, significant problems for the defendants here.
And I've seen. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
No, but that's all right. Please.
And I've seen that happen, and I don't know if you've seen it happen on the criminal side, Walter. I've seen it happen with daycare centers a number of times. There's an unfortunate death, maybe on a swing set or a slide of a child in a daycare center, and then the owners of the daycare center end up coming with either criminal neglect charges or child neglect charges or criminal recklessness or something along those lines, along with the criminal, because people do not like to see, listen, we all love our children, but people do not like to see children dying because of negligence. And there's that fine line between negligence and a criminal act. Have you seen that, Walter?
Yeah, we see it all the time, and it's one of the big issues sort of in the criminal justice system. In truth and fact, a prosecutor is probably the most powerful person in the United States. They can decide to bring charges when and where they want. They can decide what's going to happen on those cases. and we see it a lot in you have something that happens in one place and one prosecutor may handle it one way, and you go down the road 30 miles and you have a different prosecutor somewhere else and they would have handled it entirely different. So the unfortunate fact, at least now, at least in the state criminal justice system, prosecutors are elected. Every time you elect people, you bring in politics. No prosecutor ever wins an election by saying they like criminals and they're going to help out criminals. They win elections by being tough on crime, and once they're in office, I mean, everything they do is scrutinized, and if they have to run for re-election, the one case where they treated somebody leniently is going to be brought out. So it's an issue in the state criminal justice system, and it's probably why that's not the way they do things in the federal system. Federal U.S. attorneys are not elected positions; they're appointed positions.
Okay, Nick. I see that you have young nieces that you have in your family. You're taking them to a carnival or an amusement park. What type of advice are you giving to Uncle Nick or some other uncles or aunts when they're bringing their kids to the amusement parks? I mean, we're not going to call up the regulatory agency and say,
right. Right. Well, I think first off, it would be stay close. Don't stray away from me while we're at the amusement park. Right. That's always the biggest concern with large crowds, is you don't want to have the kids just disappearing. I think that would be the first item. But as far as ride safety, I think I'd probably be putting her up next to that thing and saying, nope, you don't make the height requirement on this one. Sorry, we're just not gonna do it. None of the sitting on the lap or doing anything like that to try and make it work out. Well, it's okay if we're both belted in. Those rides aren't made for the child to really, at least something like this where it's going 70 miles an hour. Those belts are made for an individual, right, who's large enough to fit in and be belted in. Now, there are some issues allegedly some issues with the seat belts on this ride as well. But, don't try and give your kid the good experience by trying to fiddle around with the requirements and have the kids sit on your lap, or if the ride says, yeah, they can sit with the parent or with an adult in this situation, okay. But, I think my advice would be follow the rules that are set forth by the park so that you don't have this type of an incident. Now, there are a lot of things in this case seem like they didn't really make a lot of sense to me, right? The netting that's over to keep people from flying out is also got these big bars in the middle of it. Like, I feel like the safety netting should have been a little bit different. And it didn't look like somebody's head was that far away from these bars when they're going down the slide or going back up. So, you can't check the regulatory agency and say this is what we do. My thing would be follow the rules that are set forth there, and hopefully. And look, if Uncle Nick's taking out Ariel to a park like this, he's going to be extra safe because I'm not. Sorry, that's the ride you're not going on. You're just not doing that because if something happened, your parents will kill me, that kind of thing. So, be extra safe like you do when you strap them into a car in the car seats. People pay close attention to what the rules are for car seats these days. I would consider this similar. I would use this similar gravity to this type of thing.
And that's something, so that's what parents can do on their part. But, like we saw in this case, it appears that the vendor, that the park owners, that, those folks didn't do their part. And in order for us to live in society, everybody really has to do their part. Right. And so that's why you have criminal laws, and that's why you have civil laws when folks have some type of culpable behavior. So you can't protect your kids for everything. All you can do is you would never want something like this to be your fault, in my view. You know what I mean? Not that it makes it better that it was somebody else's fault, but just think of the guilt. And I'm sure there's guilt to go around, everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So just to close, remember, we're not making any determinations of guilt in this case or innocence in this case. All we are doing is looking at something that has happened out in the world and trying to put some sense to why these things happen. And hopefully, if there's one person that can learn from this information and prevent something from happening, Nick and Walter, we've done our job.